The Dark Ages during the 5th to the 15th century were caused by the destruction of knowledge and economic stagnation. An example from this time is how the people of the Dark Ages built amazingly gigantic cathedrals. However, as they built them, they did not pass down the knowledge of how they had built them to the younger generation. So, as the older generation started to pass, they started to lose more and more qualified people and past experiences until there were few to none left. So when the older generation died, the knowledge of how to build these cathedrals died with them. This caused us to not be as advanced as we could be today, because we were set back with the loss of knowledge. This was all caused by a gap between the older generation and the younger generation. This lack of caring led to a collapse. And the same thing that caused the Dark Ages generation gap is now causing the conservation generation gap. Now, fortunately, our natural cathedrals of croplands, prairies, and forests are going to be protected because technology is bridging the conservation generation gap. Now, the 1930s and 80s farmers watched helplessly as their labor withered under the relentless sun. Their main goals during this time were to make sure that they could put food on the table for their families and just keep their farms and ranches. They lived through some of the worst farm failures of all time. According to the NPR, the Dirty 30s were exacerbated by erosion and soil degradation, caused by farming practices that resulted in overcultivation and bad land management. Now, from their mistakes, our older generation learned to prevent and mitigate ecological disasters. They started using much better farming and ranching techniques that we still commonly use today, like science-based pasture management and crop rotation, which replaces the nutrients to keep the soil healthier. They also started planting rows of trees where there were none. These strategically planted rows of trees prevented the wind from blowing away our precious topsoil. Now, unfortunately, our memories are short, and these tree lines are being cut down much faster than they're being replaced to make room for farmland. Now, it would appear as history marches on, we improve. Unfortunately, this is not true. The state of our environment during our older generation was much better than what it currently is now. We had crystal clear waters and used little to no chemicals on crops because, well, they simply didn't exist. We were totally organic. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, modern or conventional agricultural practices use intensive tillage, monoculture, irrigation, application of inorganic fertilizers, and chemical pest control to maximize profit and production. Now, these practices greatly increase crop yields. These conventional practices, however, have long-term ecological impacts, such as soil degradation, habitat alteration with drainage of crucial wetlands, water quality degradation, species composition impacts, and adverse effects on irrigation, like aquifer depletion. See, our younger generation not only has to put food on the table for their families, but many others as we continue to live in an increasingly growing and connected world. However, they are slowly creating the problems that our older generation had almost completely fixed, like soil degradation, because they now have to keep up with a bigger demand. And that demand challenges the idea that conservation practices actually mean more, because we're only currently looking at the now. We need technology to be able to fix the problems that we are currently facing. This new technology allows us to do many things in the future. Digital mapping allows us to monitor source point pollution problem, a possibility that didn't even exist 10 years ago. But we can go old school to bridge the gap by planting, repairing buffers, and buffer strips. This new technology that is being developed, like vertical farming, smart irrigation, and air and soil sensors, will help to inform and educate our younger generation about how to better manage our farms and environment. However, for our younger generation to learn, we need to look towards our older generation, because they have faced the same problems that we are currently facing, or surely will, if we destroy the gains of the past. Our older generation's past experience and knowledge can show us why we need this new technology to fix the problems that we are currently facing in the conservation world. This new technology is the link between our older generation and our younger generation. It gives our older generation the opportunity to teach through it by showing why we need it and how it can be used effectively. Our younger generation can then take what they have learned and apply it to what they're currently doing. So we can fix these current problems that we're facing in the conservation world, like agricultural runoff. Now, the Dark Ages were caused by the destruction of knowledge. Now, the difference between the Dark Ages generation gap and the conservation generation gap is that the conservation generation gap now has a link, thanks to technology, which means there will no longer be a conservation generation gap.